this was by far one of the more interesting, like, complete explorations in such a short amount of time for Natsu's character. As we know, like, he got his soul ripped out by Wraith. We didn't really know how this was gonna happen. I figured there was gonna be some soul shenanigans, but there was a couple things that should have been known set up in one of those that I knew going into it is he was gonna have some form of way to mess with it because as originally created as E&D, he had to have abilities established to counteract a lot of what Zeref could do. That being one of the reasons that he could mess with time. We already know, like, saw back in Tartaros that with time stopped, it didn't affect him. He somehow like got pulled into the time stop. Same thing with Demaria when she stopped time. And then burning time itself. It was something that we knew Zeref could do, and he created him to be able to resist and have counters to this. And one of the things Zeref could do is affect souls. And so I assume that as that being the case, he would have made him to have some form of soul mess aroundery. But doesn't seem to be that exact case. It does seem like he's doing some soul stuff, but not what I expected. He's taking the base idea and pretty much twisting it into its own spin, which I really liked the way it was executed. So as it was, Wraith is getting ready to eat Natsu's soul, go about it, and before he got this full chance, similar to back within the Alvarez arc when Natsu he had the whole like battle with Gray, and then afterwards, and his Ethereus powers kind of like drifted off him, and he passed out and spent some time unconscious, and he had those visions in his head, and he had like these manifestations of other people that he knew. And this was like a much further like delving into it, because they explain how this is actually not heaven or hell. Because what's funny is, so he gets there and he's in like this weird kind of like partially cloudy, while still having like lands. It all looks like on top of mountains world, and you have like this little castle. I'm very curious about that little castle. But he ends up like running into who is seemingly Zeref, and I know everyone is super excited for this, but it doesn't seem to be the actual Zeref. But it was done in a way that I think, personally, I like this more, because, it's like, okay, cool, we're gonna see Zeref, Natsu's dead, so maybe he's, like, temporarily, like, in the afterlife or in limbo, and I thought it was really funny when Natsu was like, he thought it was hell because Zeref was in there, he had to get that disrespect in there, even in this state, but Zeref is explaining it's not really heaven or hell, but he's talking about, like, essentially when Natsu has died, sort of, but it's more of like close to death. It's like this position in between, before you're not really dead, it's like undecided, and it's like before you're determined whether you're going to go to like heaven or hell, and you're almost in like this personal limbo state. So obviously time is passing way faster here versus in the actual time. So it's probably going to feel way differently, like, well, probably, like, I don't know. I actually don't really know the time span of, like, how long it would take for his, like, sins to be judged and whether or not be like, all right, you're going to heaven or you're going to hell. But as it is, he's talking to Zeref, who's, trying to explain the situation to him. And then upcoming here is Mavis, who Natsu obviously was very happy to meet. He gets a little teary-eyed. He's happy to see her. And he actually thought she was alive, but she explains, no, she's dead. And the thing I like about this is it's all in Natsu. They explain essentially it's in Natsu's subconscious. So it's all stuff that he either knows or stuff that he kind of like thinks is the case, or deep down how he felt. Like regardless, like deep down he had this kind of like idea that all these people that he knew that died would live happily in the afterlife. Like here we have like Mavis and Zeref. Like they pretty much said that now they're in this afterlife world. They're married, which is, again, like, it's nice to think that Natsu, even though he had all this beef with Zeref, he knew that Mavis cared a lot for him, so in death, he just kind of, like, pictured them happily in heaven, married, and with Larcade and August. And there was the question of, like, how would he know that August was their son? I don't think he knew. I think it was more like some form of like assumption, or him just kind of like having this idea of it. Because otherwise, why would Larcade be there? because he kind of had this idea that Larkade thought of Zeref as his dad, and so Natsu kind of just took that in as the case. And then seemingly, I guess, some of it with August. I'm a little bit curious of what Natsu came to that conclusion. Maybe he, put the pieces together within a year afterwards. Curious about that, but that's not like an important matter. Here we say, we haven't shown that Zeref and Mavis here like taking care, and they spoil these two. And again, that's showing that in this idea that even though Natsu had beef with them, they were on enemy sides. Even though what they did to eventually Mavis, he wanted them to have this happy afterlife. And then here we have him talking to Zeref, who's explaining this all to him. He says, like, no, this is all in your head. This is your vision of what heaven would be. This is the back, the deepest like areas of your mind, what exactly you want to happen, what you think of all this to kind of like lay out. I mean, what's funny is he's like, this is my idea of heaven. I figured it'd be much more like fiery and full of dragons, and I was like, that sounds a lot more like hell. And once Natsu thinks about it, dragon, here comes in Igneel, who, this was just really touching, because one thing about Natsu is obviously he cares a lot. Like, he's got his friends, he's got the people he cares about. And then with Gildarts, people always kind of saw him having that like kind of fatherly figure. I saw it more of like a role model, even though there were some times where you can kind of get like a fatherly kind of character for him. It always to me felt more like you're, that, hey, it's that guy you look up to, I don't know. It's like, oh, it's kind of like, a kid would look up at like a pro athlete, where they're an idol, but they aren't. They're just kind of like someone that they aim for. Somebody that they base certain aspects of their goals on. Whereas Igneel was his dad. I think that the gap between them is how emotional Natsu get any time that he ever thought really about Igneel, and then here we have just him in front of him, and he instantly gets a little teary eyed. And it's not like the kind of like goofy way with Mavis. It was much more of like straight, like serious. We know how much he cared about his dad and all those, pent up feelings he had over the years. And happily enough, like he's explaining like in the complete like truth, even if buried down depths of Natsu's heart, like Mavis, Igneel, Zeref are all living peacefully in this afterlife, and not just them. People like Atlas Flame, Zirconis, and then even shows like Simon. You got Jude and Layla Heartfilia, and then funny enough, Eclair and Moman, which I've many times have discussed that I didn't take Phoenix Priestess as canon. I didn't think there was enough evidence when it comes to stuff outside of the main story, unless it's like brought up explicitly in the series or like straight up said by Mishima. I wouldn't consider it canon, just because it's easy to mess with a lot of like stuff in timelines. As well as like, I think we'll play with, especially because of power levels and stuff. I don't know why, but there's boosts in it, like heavy boosts in movies, and there was a lot of craziness in Phoenix Priestess, but I didn't really consider it as much as I wouldn't really just see any movie of any series, like, unless it's strictly as tied in, then I don't really see it much as canon. But unlike here, we didn't have a lot going in for, we had a good amount for Dragon Cry to be canon. It was clear that Mishima, like, intended to be canon, like, all this stuff straight up said in the manga, as well as, like, intentions for it to tie into events in the story, and then straight up had, like, a novel of saying, like, hey, this is how it ties in. And even in an interview, he said, like, yeah, this is tied to the story. We didn't get that for Phoenix Priestess, but this is kind of undeniable, because this isn't, like, there are some times where you can see Eclair in like the background of like a panel, like it's an Easter egg. Same thing with, you get like Haru Glory and characters, but this is straight, can't be something in that kind of Easter egg area. It's something just to be like, oh yeah, you caught that, cool, you were paying attention. Because it only would make sense if Natsu knows about them, care, like had some form of like care about them, want for them to live happier in the afterlife. So it means he knows that they died. He was close to them, at least to somewhat of a degree. And that would only make sense if Phoenix Priestess was canon. And though there are some things that kind of like mess a little bit, like Elfman not having his post Grand Magic Games design, because they have their guild back, they have the main guild hall back. I mean, I can't deny it at this point. Like, there is enough evidence that I would say, yeah, this makes perfect sense of why it would be canon, because it would only make sense at this scene if Natsu knew about those events. So, right there, that is enough in my book. and I know, somebody's gonna, well, I know exactly my comments. Like, well, that guy Goose was mentioned. So, well, I still don't think that's enough just because a character's mentioned. It has to be a little bit more explicit. This is literally like, hey, the events happened because it would have, this scene would only make sense if they happened. But then we get to it, and Igneel is saying that, he's very actually kind, which again, like, you have Natsu who is saying like, oh, I thought heaven was gonna be like all fiery and dragons and stuff. But similar to how Laxus couldn't use fairy law, the way he was saying he was when he used it in the fighting festival, he's like, I'm just gonna use it and wipe everybody out. Even though he was saying that, he couldn't lie to his heart and he couldn't lie to the magic because it went off his actual, like, true intentions. Here you have Natsu. This is actually how he sees the afterlife. This kind of like naturey cloud heaven-like design. The thing I like about it that's interesting, it's like all these cliff tops above like the cloud layer, which is a lot of what Acnologia's his village looked like, which I'm very interested in. And even after like mentioning like the dragons, like Lucy's parents, Moment and Simon and Eclair, even says that maybe Acnologia is in this, as he says, beta heaven, kind of like this pre-afterlife. It's like the waiting room for afterlife, and they're personal, which is really cool. So it makes sense of why Lucy's was the Golden Plains, because that was her version, and this is what Natsu's version looks like. So all characters have a different kind of style. The Golden Plains for Lucy, Makarov's was kind of like that flowery meadow. Natsu is like this cloudy, almost mountaintop heaven place. But Igneel is, telling him how, regardless, he knows that he's truly kind, and that kindness is what makes him strong. But Natsu's a little concerned because he's like, well, I can't do anything because this guy's a ghost. I'm dead. But they explain how, well, you are kind of like that yourself, because right now you're a ghost. You're just a soul. And they're just to tell him, like, once he gets back in it, just to kind of like fight on that same level. And I really liked how in the kind of like exiting of it, Natsu thanks him. He thanks Mavis, he thanks August and Larkade, and he doesn't say, thanks to Zeref, he calls him his brother, which means that deep down he still accepts Zeref as his brother, and which kind of relates to the whole scene when he said after Zeref killed Larkade, how even if there were ties, he accepting that even though Natsu didn't really be like, I don't see them with you, but even if they're there, they weren't there anymore. But this shows that regardless, he still like has kind of like that understanding that they are brothers, and he still has that connection deep inside of him, deep in his emotions. And then him and Zeref tells him he's got to keep living. Natsu says like he's got to keep living, and then it's back in the soul world where he ends up kind of manifesting his form in the soul, and he bites in his Ray's hand and then takes form of himself. He's able to actually hit him now because he's a soul. And he's able to make contact with another soul. And this was funny. So I know there's two parts of this I know people are going to call an asshole. And before you end up saying anything to them, just remember, one, the whole like mental almost heaven thing was established with future Lucy. It was brought up again with Natsu when he was unconscious after the fight with Gray. So that existing, we already know that's a thing. And here, it's funny because Natsu's saying how he felt that someone taught him thought projection magic, but that's not the case. This is what his assumption of it was. He's like saying, "Oh, I can take form because I think somebody taught me this magic," but in reality, someone was able to explain to him in his subconscious, to take shape of his soul in order to fight as a soul being. So instead of the reality where he had like this kind of like mental conversation with the depictions of Zeref, Mavis, and Igneel and whatnot, and explaining that where he needs to get back to fighting, he needs to keep living, he needs to get a hold of himself. He's not going to remember that because I said you probably aren't going to really have a memory of it. It's in his subconscious. He just has this kind of like almost just kind of like telling in the back of his head, this is like what happened, but he's just assuming, oh yeah, somebody must have taught me thought projection magic at some point. But in reality, it was this conversation he had with, these inner parts of his mind. And, they explained to him that he can fight in this soul form. And I know people are going to not understand that. And they're going to think, well, Natsu just developed this whole magic in the middle of a fight when he was literally a soul. And no, that's not the case. It was moreover that's what he's assuming happened and not what actually happened. Other than that, Comment below. I really like that we're getting a lot of like good character stuff. I thought we'd be getting more action, but this was a really good character chapter for Natsu. A lot of good progression and development for his character. We got a good push forward, and all around just a nice delving into a much more mature state of him. Because we know that even though Natsu is silly a lot of the time, he likes to be a funny guy. This is what he actually like. This is how he actually thinks. This is his much more serious side, is like deeper emotion and like the raw seriousness of how he feels, not how he tries to put on a goofy personality or be like a jokester. This is the full depths of how he sees and perceives characters, and both how he wants them to be. And uh, this just makes me wonder if he's gonna remember like this kind of subconscious at Igneel again if we get to a scene where when he's fighting Igneel and maybe Wendy uses Milky Way on Natsu's scarf and brings back Igneel, and that happens, I might cry. That legitimately, that scene will be so much for me, and I'm looking forward to that fight, and I'm hoping that'll happen. It would be so cool to see like Igneel come back and talk to his two sons, even find out that one of them even exists in the first place. Other than that, comment below. Tell me what you thought about this chapter. I'm looking forward to the fight. I'm really don't want. I don't expect Natsu to like destroy Wraith. He'll probably defeat him, but it'll be odd that he's gonna defeat this soul being, and I'm curious to know what's gonna happen because Wraith can't. I mean, he's already dead. I mean, if Natsu somehow destroys him, he would have to destroy his soul, and there'd be no coming back from that. I imagine he'll just kind of like beat his soul into like the point he can't really. He's not gonna fight back, or maybe he has to retreat. Because Wraith and Scullion are definitely my favorites out of Diablos right now, and I don't want him to go. I want him to stay, and I'm hoping Wraith gets converted and he ends up joining the Fairy Tail Guild. Definitely out of all the Dragoneers so far, he's the one I want the most. Anyway, comment below. Tell me what you thought about the chapter. Tell me what you think in the comments below. Really appreciate your thumbs up the video. Prefer the like button, subscribe button, and check out my other videos. I appreciate everyone who's already subscribed, and thank you all for listening. Bye.